Hello and welcome to 502 Conversations. I'm Brian Kirby, and my guest today is Dr. Joe Schwarcz, Director of the McGill Office for Science and Society. Dr. Joe, how are you doing today?
Very well, thanks very much.
I have a proper intro for you, so I shall give that, and then we'll get started with the conversation. And as I tell my guests, I know this is when you hear a lot of nice things about yourself, so it can be awkward, but try to go with it. I mean, you've done a lot. There's no doubt about it. Dr. Joe is fondly referred to as Dr. Joe, and he is well known for his informative and entertaining public lectures on topics ranging from the chemistry of love to the science of aging. Dr. Joe has received numerous awards for teaching chemistry and interpreting science for the public, and is the only non-American ever to win the American Chemical Society's prestigious Grady Stack Award for demystifying chemistry. He hosts the Dr. Joe Show on Montreal's CJAD radio and has appeared hundreds of times on the Discovery Channel, CTV, CBC, TV Ontario, and Global Television. Dr. Joe also writes the newspaper column The Right Chemistry for the Montreal Gazette and has authored a number of books, including bestsellers Radar, Hula Hoops, and Playful Pigs, An Apple a Day, The Myths, Misconception, and Truths About the Food We Eat, Quack Quack, The Threat of Pseudoscience, and in 2015, he was awarded the Balls Prize for Critical Thinking by the Committee for Skeptical Inquiry in recognition of his book, Is That a Fact? Frauds, Quacks, and the Real Science of Everyday Life. His newest book, Superfoods, Silkworms, and Spandex, Science and Pseudoscience in Everyday Life, hits bookshelves in May 2024 and is available to pre-order right now. I should also add that, Dr. Joe, you are an amateur magician, and often you spice up your presentations with a little bit of magic. And like most magicians, you have a profound disdain for pseudoscience and charlatans, from psychics to so-called alternative health practitioners, which is evident from the subtitle of most of your books. Is that correct?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, my office is dedicated to separate myth from fact. And in fact, our stated mandate is to separate sense from nonsense. And of course, also in the process to disseminate sound, scientific, evidence-based information.
Before we talk specifically about your work in the office, let's talk broadly. Well, first, tell me about yourself. So how did you end up in Montreal? You have an interesting origin story, so if you don't mind.
Yeah, I was born in Hungary after the war, and under Russian occupation. And so, I was essentially exposed to communism in Hungary, although I can't say that my memories are bad. I mean, I had a very good childhood. But my parents, of course, were disturbed by living under the communist regime, where you had to watch who you speak to and what you say, and the lack of availability of goods, and heard all kinds of good things about America. And then when the Hungarian Revolution occurred in 1956, we had a chance to escape, and escape was the right word, because we had to crawl under the wires, the wire fence. We had to make sure that we were not in the path of the searchlights. We had a guide because the border had been mined, so you had to know where you were able to cross. So I remember in the mud, crawling under the fence, running across the open area, avoiding the searchlight, getting into Austria. And because my mother had a sister who lived in Montreal, we very quickly got the permission to come to Montreal. And so essentially, I grew up here because I was in grade 3 when I came here. I didn't speak a word of English, and I remember the very first word I learned in English was next, because they put me into class and the students were reading out loud. And the teacher kept saying next, next, to go to the next student. So that was the first English word that I learned. And from then on, I was in Montreal. Scientific career kind of traces back to when I was in grade 6, by which time, of course, I had learned English. At that young age, you learn it very quickly. And anyway, my friend's parents had invited me to a birthday party. And it was a party where we're sitting around the living room, and they had hired a magician to entertain us, who actually was not very good. He was a teenager, and most of the tricks he did were, very forgettable. But there was one that he performed that, believe it or not, turned out to be life-changing, because he had what looked like 3 ropes, and magically, all of a sudden, he tied them together, and they became one long rope with the knots having vanished. And he said that he had done this by sprinkling an invisible magic chemical onto the ropes. Now, of course, I knew that there was no invisible magic chemical. And I wondered why he had used those words. Why not abracadabra or hocus pocus or alakazam, which are the usual words that, magicians use. And I took out a book on magic and a book out of chemistry from the library. Wanted to see what the sense here was. And I learned a lot of things. I learned, of course, that magic and chemistry have some very interesting relationships, because, of course, everything a magician does on the stage is done by perfectly explicable scientific means, to which the audience, of course, is not privy. And chemistry can look magical as well, because you pour together 2 liquids, let's say, and you see a dramatic color change. Unless you know something about indicators and acids and bases, it looks absolutely magical. But in science, we like to take out the magic and provide the explanation, whereas the magician, of course, wants to entertain and hide that explanation. So I've used magic as a vehicle because, it is very important to make observations and come to conclusions. That's what science is all about. And really, when you're watching a magician on the stage, what are you really trying to do? You're trying to solve a problem. You see something that seems to be impossible, that seems to counter the laws of nature, and you start wondering, how was that done? And that's the scientific process. You ask why, and you try to find an answer. And that is exactly what we do in chemistry, physics, biology as well. We have a problem, we try to find an answer. And really, that's what I've been doing for more decades than I guess I can even remember.
And there's no doubt that knowing a little bit of chemistry could have been the basis for countless fraudsters for hundreds of years, right? Fooling people into buying this or that based on just a little demonstration. And
Absolutely. I mean, pseudoscience and quackery has been with us since time immemorial. It will always be with us. We're not going to be able to wipe it out. But hopefully what we can do is give people some tools to foster critical thinking, kind of educate people about how to think about issues, not telling them what to think, but giving them guidelines how to go about it, in order to, see through the tricks that many of the charlatans often use. And these are not only physical tricks, but they're also verbal tricks, where they try to goad you into buying certain products by, cherry picking data and using selective information and often misinformation. So it's a very challenging thing, especially these days, because we are living in the age of information and misinformation and disinformation. Of course, that is largely aided and abetted by the internet, because information is so pervasive. It comes at us from every corner every day. A lot of it very sound information, and a lot of it total nonsense. And how to filter out the nonsense is the challenging part, and that's essentially what we deal with through our office.
let's talk about that. I like to say we're all susceptible, right? Because we can all be fooled. And so let's speak broadly about chemistry before we get into the specifics about your book. So in terms of being susceptible to misinformation, medical misinformation or supplements or whatever, so chemicals, I mean, just that word induces fear and disdain and avoidance in many, right? So chemicals bad, nature good. I want an all natural, organic, chemical-free life. All right. What do you have to say about that?
Well, unfortunately, that's the myth that I've been fighting for many, many years. The word chemical is not a synonym for poison or toxin. Unfortunately, that's how many people perceive it. chemicals are just the basic building blocks of all matter. And we have about 162 million chemicals that are registered in chemical abstracts, which is a compendium of chemical knowledge. That's a lot of chemicals. So even a simple meal that we would consume will contain thousands of different kinds of chemicals. And they are not good or bad. Chemicals have no morality. They don't make any decisions. People make decisions. And the only way we can know if a chemical is beneficial or detrimental is by studying it, not by looking at its ancestry. Just because something is created in nature doesn't mean that it is any way superior to something that is created in the laboratory. A chemical made by a chemist in a lab can be better or worse than the chemical that is made in nature. There's no equivalence here. It all depends on what that chemical is. Nature is full of very, very poisonous substances. Indeed, the most toxic substances are all natural. If we, think of botulin produced by Botulinum clostridium bacterium, or ricin and castor beans, strychnine, arsenic. I mean, these are all naturally occurring substances. So again, I underline that the only way that we know if something is good or bad, and to what extent, is by studying it. And that brings us, to the area of disseminating knowledge, because once you've studied something, you've got to let others know about what it is that you found. And the way that we do this in the scientific world is through the peer-reviewed publication system. So a researcher will write up their study and send it into the editor of a journal, who then sends it out to 2 or 3 what we call referees, who are experts in the field, who will look over it. And very often there's a lot of back and forth, asking questions, asking some of the work to be redone, and eventually a decision is made whether or not this merits publication. And if it gets published, it gets into a journal, and that's how others find out about it. That's how we know things in science. But not all journals have the same impact. Some are much more sought after in terms of publication than others, because they are higher level. So just because something is peer-reviewed doesn't necessarily mean that it is set in stone. Unfortunately, that terrible paper by Andrew Wakefield that linked to the MMR vaccine was published in The Lancet, which is one of the world's premier medical journals. How does that happen? Because when you get a paper to referee, you have to assume that everything is honestly reported, and that the data that you're asked to review were properly accumulated by the researchers, and their interpretation is correct. If someone is going to submit fraudulent data, you're not going to catch that until someone sometime for some reason tries to duplicate the work. And that, of course, is what happened with the vaccine business, but it took 20 years until that work was duplicated or found not to be able to be duplicated. It turned out to be fraudulent. And by that time, we started to see epidemics of measles, which we hadn't seen in decades. But nevertheless, the peer-reviewed literature is still the best way to go, although it is not foolproof.
I do have Radar, Hula Hoops, and Playful Pigs. It was one of your earlier books. So can you tell me about that and where that one came from?
That book now is a collector's item, actually.
Oh, it is?
Yeah, it is. So hang on to it. Yeah.
Oh, I have it. It's right behind me here.
Yeah, I don't know if it's still in print. The others are still in print.
Well, if I make it to Montreal, I'll get you to sign it sometime.
Actually, Radar, Hula Hoops, and Playful Pigs was my first book, which goes back over 20 years. And there's an interesting story there because of the title of that book. And generally, I like to pick titles that intrigue people and that show that science is all over the place, and so that's how I came up with radar and Hula. But radar, of course, was critical during the Second World War. And in order to make radar work properly, you needed insulation around the cables. And that was done with polyethylene, which is a plastic that was developed during the Second World War. After the Second World War, there was a lot of this material left over. And the question was what to do with it. And a clever inventor used polyethylene to make hula hoops. And this was very good in terms of marketing. It was very successful. And actually, it was a good way to exercise as well. So, but what about the pig connection? Well, it turns out that when pigs are raised and they're in close proximity, they get annoyed with each other and they bite each other's tails and each other's ears. And farmers, of course, tried to detract them from doing this. And a farmer discovered that when he threw a ball into the pig pen, the pigs would roll those around and leave each other alone. So those came to be called pig balls. So when we were playing around with the title, it was going to be radar hula hoops, and the question was, what do we do with the pigs? And I wasn't going to have a book called Pig Balls with pig ball in the title. So we looked around, for something that was better. So I thought, these pigs were kind of playful. So we came up with radar hula hoops and playful pigs. And that, was the first in a series of books. And the theme always is to show interesting examples of chemistry specifically, because that's my area of interest, and how they relate to everyday life. And now I try to make each of the stories, and the books have numerous stories, and they're all about 1,000, 1,200 words. So, you can pick one up, read it, say, isn't that interesting? You don't have to read from, page 1 to page 300. You can pick up anywhere. And next time you go to the bathroom, you pick it up again and you open it to another page and you find something else that's interesting. So that's how it all started, is with the playful pigs. And, I had stories in there about, all kinds of things, from detergents to cosmetics to medications to food. And those have been, my major areas of interest. And there's never a scarcity of topics because there's something new that comes out virtually every day, whether it is telling us what to eat or what to stay away from. And usually, there are problems with those studies, and then we have to look to see, which is valid, which is not valid. So it certainly keeps us busy every day.
And I think that was like 1999. So was that right about the founding of the Science and Society? And so
yes, we're just about ready to celebrate our 25th anniversary. And actually, on May 23rd, we're going to have a bash to celebrate our 25th anniversary. But actually, with a couple of colleagues, I had been doing this kind of work long before the founding of the office, and doing public lectures and doing chemistry magic shows, etc. But it was in 1999 that the university said, well, this is important enough to formalize it, and created the office, which is really is unique. I don't know of any other such office in other universities, which is totally dedicated to separating sense and nonsense, mostly for the public, but of course for our students as well.
25th anniversary coming up. I don't even know how many books, 13, 14, dozens of books, but specifically
19.
How many?
19.
Wow. And thousands of online articles people can find. So,
yeah.
But let's talk a little bit before that, because it's in your bio. You have a call-in chemistry show, and that's still on the air, correct?
Yes, that is on the air.
How did that start, and how many years ago was that?
There's a story therein too. That radio show now has been going on for 43 years. I do it every Sunday afternoon from 3 to 4 Eastern time. I like to say it's the longest running radio show on chemistry in the history of the world, which I think it is, but it also may be the only radio show on chemistry in the history of the world. So anyway, that started in a very interesting fashion. And about 43 years ago, when with a couple of colleagues, I was asked to put on a scientific display at the Man and His World annual exhibit in Montreal. In 1967, we had Expo 67 here, which was a World's Fair, just wonderful. And after that, the city tried to keep the spirit of this going annually, using the original Expo 67 site as sort of a fair. And one of the pavilions there was the UNESCO Pavilion, which is the scientific arm of the United Nations, and they wanted a scientific display of some kind. So they contacted me, and we put on this display where we hired some students to do chemical demonstrations, and we did chemistry magic shows and gave public lectures. And one of the demonstrations that we did was to form polyurethane. This is a foam, and it's a very impressive demo because you take two liquids, you pour them together, and it begins to foam, comes out of the cup, forms a mushroom that hardens. Very interesting. And polyurethane was used as a foam in mattresses. It was used to make the insides of Miss Piggy, for example. Very interesting and useful material. So we're demonstrating that, but this was at a time when there was another foam that was in the news, and that was urea formaldehyde. We had just come through the 1970s, the energy crisis, and people were insulating. And urea formaldehyde was insulating material that could be pumped into walls, and it would set as a foam, very good insulating material. But if it was improperly applied, it would release formaldehyde, which is a highly toxic substance. So there was a lot of concern about that. But of course, that's not what we were demonstrating. We were demonstrating polyurethane. But anyway, on a Monday morning, and I remember this with crystal clarity, I picked up my Montreal Gazette, and on page 3, there was a headline about chemistry. So I started reading, of course, and it turned out that it was an article about our exploits at this pavilion. And the reporter was saying that while the whole public was worried about urea formaldehyde, here were these chemists telling everyone what a wonderful material it is. So by about 9 o'clock that morning, I had a letter on his desk, together with an egg that I made out of polyurethane, a big egg about like this with a string on it, that he was to hang around his neck for penance for having laid this scientific egg. And I explained to him that just because two things looked to be the same, they were both foams, they could be chemically very different. And I gave him an analogy. I said, look, you could be holding a clear glass of liquid, and you don't know whether it's water or vodka until you taste it. And being a reporter, he understood this particular analogy to vodka. Anyway, the next day, he printed a very nice mea culpa article, a retraction, which reporters rarely do. And he said that the real problem wasn't urea formaldehyde or polyurethane. The real problem was that he had skipped too many chemistry classes in high school, and he had not realized that two foams could look the same and be very different. And I thought that was very nice. And I thought that, this was a dead story. And then the next day, I get a call from radio station. This was CJAD in Montreal, asking me if I would like to come on the air to comment on this controversy. So I said, sure, I can comment, but there's no controversy here. So I went and I told the story very much like I told it to you, and I guess they liked the way I said it, because the next week there was something else, and they called me to comment. And then pretty soon they asked if I would like to come on regularly in order to deal with callers' questions. Being young and innocent in those days, I said, sure, we'll do that. And that's how it started. And it's been going on every week. I've not missed a single week in 43 years.
It's it's live, though, not pre-taped.
It is live. It is
Wow.
live. But now, of course, it's also recorded so that we have all of the shows available as podcasts. And everything that we do is available on our website, which is mcgill.ca/OSS. So anyone can listen to previous shows or read articles, etc., just by going there. So that's how it all started. And curiously, the reporter who had written that, about a decade later, became program director at CJAD, like this curious juxtaposition. And I never stopped reminding him that whatever success I had on the radio was due to his chemical ignorance. And he generally took that jibe very well.
So I got to ask, with the anonymity of radio, you must, over, I don't know how many years, you said 35 or whatever, you must have gotten some interesting questions.
Oh, we'll get interesting questions all the time.
So give me like one or two. Like, would you...
One time I had to figure out how to open a cremation urn. Relative had been cremated, and of course the dust is put into an urn, and according to the will, it's supposed to be scattered over a lake where they had a country house, but the family couldn't open the urn because somehow it had been sealed. So I had to actually make a house call, and we played around with some solvents and eventually figured out how to open up the urn and scattered the dust. Then there was another time when I had to make a house call, believe it or not, on a Cabbage Patch doll.
You made a house call?
Yes, I made a house call because a caller had called up. This was during the days when these Cabbage Patch dolls became very, very popular. And the people were standing in line actually to buy those dolls. And this lady had bought one for her daughter and had stood in line a long time to get this and took it home. And I guess the young girl's brother didn't like to see her sister so happy. So he took an ink marker and painted a mustache on the poor doll. And the little girl was totally devastated by this. And they had tried to wipe it off with, soap and detergent, and didn't work. So I actually made a house call on this, again with my solvents, and eventually using methylene chloride, I was able to remove the mustache, and happiness was restored.
Wow, that is something.
Yeah. I mean, that goes back a long time. And also, interestingly enough, over the years, that the type of questions have changed. Because originally, people would ask the kind of questions that you think they would ask a chemist. How do you make lipstick, or how does aspirin work? What are plastics? And eventually, the focus kind of shifted to risk. These days, so often I get questions: is this safe? Or, what are these perfluoroalkyl substances? Or do I have to worry about the phthalates leaching out from my plastics? And especially after COVID, this became the focus when people started to worry about not only the disease itself, but the safety of the vaccine, and about the possibility that, hydroxychloroquine, is it a treatment or not? Or what about ivermectin? And, what about the things that Trump was saying about, simple solutions to COVID? So it's it's kind of interesting looking back on how the focus has changed, and a lot of that, of course, is because of the availability of information. I mean, truckloads of information that come at us every day. Much of it, of course, nonsensical, and you have to sort of develop the tools to know how to filter all of that stuff.
Let's talk about Dr. Joe in person. I've seen you give a couple of public talks. They're informative, entertaining, and actually there's a lot of humor in them too. And often, again, there's that science versus pseudoscience message. But I'm wondering, science communication has been developing for decades, right? So how did you develop that style as a science communicator? I mean, did you do public lectures that fell flat and you had to figure it out, or did you have a mentor, or were you just, that's how you are?
Science communication is a specialty, just like any other area of science. Whether you're talking about, neurochemistry, or whether you're talking about polymer chemistry, you need expertise. And the same thing happens in scientific communication. You have to work out what works and what doesn't work. Now, the fact that I got interested in magic so early in life, I think, was very helpful, because when you're performing, you learn what the audience appreciates and how to go about communicating with the audience. because, as I told you, I got interested in both science and magic at a very early age, and I started reading about both of these. I very quickly learned from taking out books and from the library about the role of chemistry. I mean, I remember, at a very young age, reading about how plastics are made and how certain drugs function, and how you make paints, for example. And I was hoping that when I got into high school, I'd learn formally about these things. That never really happened. What I learned in high school chemistry was devastating. I'm surprised that I stuck with it, because there was just memorizing things and drawing diagrams of laboratory equipment. We never even went into the lab. Then I
Wow, I
thought,
am so glad to hear you say that. Go on.
and then I thought that when I would get into university, I'd see all of these interesting applications. Now, my university profs were extremely good. I mean, I learned the sound basics of chemistry, but I didn't learn about applications. No one mentioned connections, and that bothered me, because I knew that there were all these connections that I had independently read about. And I said to myself, if I ever had the chance of getting into academia, I would make sure that the students knew why they were learning all of this fundamental stuff. And luckily, I have had the chance to teach, and I've had over 50,000 students, in my courses over the years, which is a lot of students. And my technique always has been to make sure that whenever I was teaching, even if it was a complex subject, that I made sure that they knew why they were doing this, why there was a light at the end of the tunnel. And admittedly, sometimes the tunnel is long and it's dark, but there is light at the end. So no matter what I was teaching, whether it was, how polymers are constructed, or what the Rutherford experiments were, it was always with a view towards what is the benefit that society has from all of this scientific activity. And I think students took that very well when I always used practical examples. And I think they went home at night, they talked about these things around the dinner table. And then I started to get to be asked from parents groups, study groups, to speak to them. And then it grew and grew, and I started to be asked to speak at conferences and universities. And, it kind of mushroomed from that. And, over the years, you kind of learn what works and what doesn't work. Images work very well. The story that a picture is worth 1,000 words is absolutely true. And that's why I use a lot of slides, a lot of visuals in all my presentations, because people remember them. I still, get former students telling me that they remember specific pictures. And as you were mentioning, humor, I think, is important. Humor kind of lubricates a presentation. It's the sweetener that makes the bitter go down. And it also portrays to the audience that you're not a robot, that you're a human. And that's why I like to put in personal experiences into my presentations. So it's an evolution. You learn what works and what doesn't work. And it's also an evolution in terms of learning how to deal with the pseudoscientists, how to deal with the charlatans, and how to deal with the people who believe what the charlatans are saying. And that is one of the most challenging things, because, I have to deal a great deal with quack cancer treatments, for example. And I can understand that desperate people will do desperate things. There's no doubt about that. And I never blame people who are diagnosed with some terrible condition and will, explore everything out there, much of which is total quackery, especially in the cancer area. So I don't blame them, but I blame the people who are making money off of them by claiming that they have secret magic cancer cures, which of course are being hidden by big bad pharma. So you have to learn how to deal with those people. and how to coax them into reading the right kind of literature and kind of guiding them on who to believe and who not to believe. It doesn't work by being aggressive. When people have some kind of belief, even if that belief is totally in pseudoscience, it doesn't work to tell them that they're ignorant. You have to do it more gently. You have to try to ask questions why do you think this? Where did you get that kind of information? How reliable do you think that is? So I've learned over the years to kind of deal with this kind of thing, but sometimes I must say it's difficult, especially when you're dealing with the quacks themselves, who are purveying the information, especially when you deal with ones who are giving out disinformation because that their scientific education is such that they must know that what they're saying is nonsense. And those are the toughest ones to deal with. And it's really quite mind-boggling how many people who are supposedly well versed in science go astray. You look at people like Dr. Oz, a very legitimate cardiac surgeon. And, at first he was very good when he was occasionally on with Oprah telling people to eat broccoli and exercise, all very good. And then when he was given his daily show, you got to fill an hour every day of network television, and then started all of this silly stuff about green coffee bean extract and raspberry ketone, stuff that I think he must have known just was nonsense, because you can't have the scientific background that he had and buy into that. So these are the kind of things that are difficult to deal with.
It's interesting you say that. Of course, now we got to get to superfoods. But I've been surprised at how some science education is devoid of science. I don't know if I can say that right. In my own graduate school experience, science in the public program that I did, in working on science communication, there's science education. I was reading a paper and I found that one of the most cited researchers in science education is also an iridologist and a Reiki master. So he's a science educator, but science seems to be separate somehow.
Right. Well, depends on who's calling them a science educator. I would not be calling those people science educators.
Exactly. Well, but he works at a major university, teaches doctoral students in this, and it's just, how can this possibly be? I'm reading this info, I'm thinking, I don't understand this.
Well, there's a whole area that today we call Quackademia, which is the infiltration of quacks into academia. And unfortunately, it happens. There are naturopaths who are teaching courses in universities. But what we really need to teach is critical thinking. And, that always has been my emphasis. And just because someone has a scientific background doesn't mean that you need to believe them. Unfortunately, being educated is not a vaccine against stupidity. That's one thing that we certainly find. And you have to be very careful to whom you listen. And you have to do some research on who is speaking and why they are saying what they are saying. And are they making money in some way off of what they are saying? Do they have some sort of ulterior motive, whether it's self-aggrandizement or financial fortune that they're seeking? So you got to do your research into seeing who's saying what and why they're saying it. Are they being funded by any questionable kind of organization? What the motivation is. So to get good science out there takes a lot of work. It's a lot of effort.
All right, back to you. Sorry about that little digression, but it seemed to come naturally. So I want to get to superfoods, but two questions. What do you think was the biggest, if you could pin something over the centuries, what's the greatest triumph of chemistry? And then what was the biggest foible, in your opinion? I know it's a big question.
Well, the biggest triumph, I would say, really has to be the understanding of chemical basics. of what molecules are, what molecular structure is, how atoms join together to make molecules, and what chemical reactions are all about. Because that is really the gateway to everything. I mean, if we're going to synthesize a new substance, whether it's nylon that was first synthesized in the 1930s, what it is based on is knowing what are the raw materials that you need, what you have to do to them to carry out a chemical reaction. And that depends on understanding the fundamental nature of substances. Now, of course, the ancient Greeks already were into that, asking questions about what everything was made of. But they came to conclusions, that everything was somehow made of air, wind, water, and fire. No, everything is made of atoms, which are joined together to make molecules, etc. And that understanding, which really came in the 1800s, is the key to everything. And that has mushroomed into all of the benefits that we know in modern chemistry. In terms of pitfall, I would say it was the continued failure to educate students properly at a very early stage. I think chemical education should begin in elementary school. Kids are very curious at that age, and you can get basic concepts across to them. And if you learn at a very early stage about these basic ideas and about critical thinking, then you don't have to deal with the problems that we see today with the anti-vaxxers, who have no understanding of fundamental immunology or, fundamental chemistry. So I would say that the biggest failing has been the lack of good education early on.
All right, specifically books now. 19, you say, your latest or your newest coming out, Superfoods, Silkworms, and Spandex. More than 60 short essays in there. Like you said, you can pick it up and read one, put it down, come back and read it again. What's the connection between Superfoods, Silkworms, and Spandex? You told me about radar, hula hoops, and playful pigs.
Well, really, the only connection in this case is the alliteration. Is that each one starts with the letter S. But the reason that I picked those is actually to trigger this kind of question of, why are we talking about these, which seem to be so dramatically different concepts and substances? Well, what connects them is chemistry, is that each one has a fascinating chemical story behind it. And as soon as you see what that story is, you see all kinds of links, chemical links. So superfoods, of course, is a term that we hear so much these days. I mean, if you look on Amazon, God knows how many books there are, promising prevention of disease and recuperation of health if you just eat the right things. The word superfood actually was only coined around 1990 in a book by a British naturopath, Juan Stratton, who wrote a book called Superfoods, where he basically talked about various kinds of vitamins, supplements, and plant extracts as having value that was greater than just simple nutrition. Well, of course, scientists have been wondering about what we should be eating ever since we started eating, because it was pretty quickly evident that food is the only raw material that ever goes into our body, right? So that we obviously are made of the food that we eat. And Hippocrates supposedly coined the expression, "Let thy food be thy medicine," although I've never actually been able to find documentation that he said that. But maybe he did. He said some smart things. He said that flax was very good for the intestines, but he also thought that pigeon droppings were great for baldness. Mercifully, he didn't have to eat them. He was supposed to rub them on a bald head. But if you take a look at Hippocrates' picture, you see that it didn't work very well. So anyway, I mean, even 2,000 years ago, people worried about what to eat. But they really didn't know, because they didn't know about the science of food. We only started to learn about that in the 1800s. And again, that takes us to molecular structure, because it was only when we began to understand about proteins and fats and carbohydrates and vitamins that we understood what food was actually composed of. And we began to wonder what were the ideal components in food. So, of course, the theory behind the superfood is not a scientific bankrupt idea, because one would think that, there are some nutrients that we need more than others, and there are some substances in food we don't need at all. So it should be possible to put together something that, that we think is beneficial. But the mistake here is trying to go the single food route. That's just not how the body works. We take in thousands of compounds in our food, and each of these has some sort of possible function. Very difficult to tease out. What we really need to look at is the overall diet. And there are some healthy diets and there are some unhealthy diets. And we know these days that the closer we are to a plant-based diet, although not necessarily exclusively a plant-based diet, the healthier that is. And this comes from the so-called Mediterranean diet, where, there are a lot of fruits and nuts and fish consumed with very little butter, very little animal fat. Most of the fat they eat is olive oil, which is a monounsaturated fat. So we have a pretty good idea what we should be eating. We know what a good diet is. We know what a poor diet is. The poor diet is the Western diet with all of the junk food that we have, the high fat, high salt processed foods. But there's no single food that will have miraculous properties. Yes, it is better to have berries and fruits and salads in our diet, but there's no single one that I would, label as a superfood. Now, I tell you the truth, I like to eat berries every morning. I eat berries and oatmeal and yogurt, which I think is also beneficial because of the live bacteria. But it is certainly possible to eat all of this and still have a terrible diet, because if you would be, after that breakfast, if you go to McDonald's and eat your hamburger every day, and for supper, you have pizza or a steak, you're undermining what you've done with your blueberries and your flaxseed and your yogurt. So you got to look at the overall diet, and that's why whenever people ask me, and sometimes students ask me to evaluate what their diet is, I say the only way that I can do that is if you keep a food diary, and you got to keep it for at least 2 weeks, and you have to write down everything that you eat. Everything. Don't leave anything out, and include amounts of everything. I get very few of these questioners back because they find out how difficult it is to do this. And they also become kind of sheepish because they see that, they're not eating the right things. So it's the overall diet that we have to emphasize. And the only superfood is whatever Superman eats. That you can call a superfood. But other than that, no. But there are certainly components of a diet that we should emphasize more than others.
I want to ask you about something in the book that stood out to me because Better Living Through Chemistry. I'm a sailor. You don't know that, but I'm a sailor, right? So in the summertime, I sail. And I got to tell you, even on a hot day on land, it can be pretty cold on the water because the water temperature is lower and the wind picks it up at night. The wind picks up the temperature of the water and blows it in your face. So you could be wearing a heavy coat on a warm summer day if you're out on the water. So, but one summer, my wife bought me some soups in a can, but they weren't really in a can. I don't know what it was, some kind of synthetic material. But they were self-heating. So I pushed like a button on the bottom, and then in a couple of minutes, I've got this hot soup to eat or whatever it was in there. That's better living through chemistry, right? What's going on?
It is, and it's pretty clever. It says it's the use of chemistry in an ingenious fashion. Calcium oxide is the chemical that makes all this possible. Calcium oxide is also what is called lime. It has nothing to do with the lime fruit, but it just coincidentally happens to be called lime. And calcium oxide is produced from limestone, which is calcium carbonate, which is mined. And if you heat calcium carbonate, you drive off carbon dioxide and you have left behind calcium oxide. And when you take calcium oxide and you dissolve it in water, it dissolves very quickly to form calcium hydroxide. But it dissolves in what we call an exothermic fashion. Chemical reactions that release heat are called exothermic. So what you have in this container are different compartments. Your soup is in one container, underneath it and sealed from it is another container which contains water. Beside that is yet another container, a smaller one, that contains the calcium oxide. When you push that button on the bottom of the can, you break the barrier between the calcium oxide and the water. You get the exothermic reaction that heats the soup from the bottom up. And as you've mentioned, it's a very useful chemical reaction. And of course, it's also one that we used to teach because it gets you into talking about exothermic and endothermic chemical reactions. And then from there, you get into, other connections of where one would use calcium oxide. It is the main component in making cement. Calcium oxide is mixed with sand and gravel. And you make cement, and then you add water to it, you make concrete. It's the biggest use of calcium oxide in the world. I mean, concrete is the substance in the world that is produced to the greatest extent. There's more concrete produced in the world than anything else, as you can imagine from all the construction. But there are issues there too. So now look, we started with the story of warming up your soup, and all of a sudden we're into concrete, and from there we're going to go into global warming, because in order to make concrete, you need the calcium oxide. And as I said, calcium oxide is made from calcium carbonate by driving off the carbon dioxide by heating it. So that means that we're putting CO2 into the air. You're getting global warming. And also, when you're making the cement, to aggregate it, you have to heat it. That also, you need fossil fuel that generates more CO2. So these are the kind of things that I like to talk about, where you can make the connection, And for example, I might start a story like that about the soup can and global warming with Tom Sawyer, and the story about whitewashing the fence, if you may remember that, which is a story where Tom Sawyer's Aunt Polly asked him to whitewash the fence, and he doesn't really want to do this. So he all of a sudden enlists all of his friends to do it, making this into fun and games. Well, what is whitewash? Whitewash is actually calcium hydroxide. And when you put this on wood and the water evaporates, it leaves behind calcium oxide. So the whitewashing is actually calcium oxide, exactly the same thing that you found in your soup. And then from that, I can even venture into the story of limelight and where that from. Limelight, which was the original lighting in theaters, was made by heating up a piece of calcium oxide. When calcium oxide is heated to high temperature, it becomes incandescent. It produces a great deal of light, and if you put a lens in front of it, you get a spotlight. So in the very early days of the theater, what you had was a jet of hydrogen, which was generated by dropping zinc into hydrochloric acid in a container. That generates hydrogen. You impinge the hydrogen onto the calcium oxide, light the hydrogen, the calcium oxide glows. You put a lens in front of it, and you get a spotlight. You can also get a theater fire. These days, of course, we use electricity to make spotlights, but originally the limelight was really calcium oxide.
Yeah, I'm surrounded by LED lights now and fireproof curtains.
Right. And the LED lights, of course, do not generate very much heat. And you're not going to set fire because of the LED lights. And of course, they also use a lot less energy, which is, one of their main marketing features.
But limelight is still in the vernacular in the theater. So
Oh, absolutely, it is. Absolutely, it is. Except, of course, now we use electric filament to produce the glow, not heated calcium
it doesn't
oxide.
have quite the same ring. Hey, you're really in the LED light tonight.
Right.
Congratulations. All right. I know we're going to run over time here, so I got to ask a question. We didn't even get into a tenth of what I wanted to talk about or ask about the books. But let's talk about your writing style because, again, these are 60 or so short sections people can read. But I really like the style where you kind of start with a story that ropes somebody in. Like one of them was Coca-Cola or whatever it is versus Coca-Cola. But then it becomes a discussion of a history of stimulants like ephedrine and amphetamines. And then you bring it back to complete the first section. So like a sandwich.
That's my style.
Did you develop? I mean, is this something that
I
you?
did. I did develop that over the years because you find out that you capture people's attention very quickly in your first couple of sentences. It's very important. Um, Headlines are also important, but the two first sentences of an article is really where you capture the attention. So I like to start with something that people already may have heard of. So, for example, I start a story on plastics by talking about The Graduate, which is a classic 1967 film where the young graduate is corralled by a family friend and he doesn't know what career he's launching into and whispers plastics, into his ear. And then you get into the story of plastics, and you kind of gently get into the chemistry. And yes, as you said, I like to cycle back at the end, and usually come up with somewhat maybe of a witty or humorous phrase at the end. So you kind of learn about how to capture people's attention. And one thing that I'm very careful to do is not to trivialize the science. I find you can make science very interesting and you can give them a complete picture without trivializing it. But you do have to be careful about how you do that. You have to make sure that whenever you introduce a new concept or a new term, that you define it very carefully. But I don't assume any kind of scientific knowledge on by my readers. So I try to teach them all the science that they need to know, and I think I've developed a system of doing that, and I can interest them and give them the information without trivializing the science. So it's all a question of using the right terms, using the right analogies.
All right. Can I ask what may be a final question that some may find trivial, but it's super important to me? And I'm not sure it's chemistry, so if it's not chemistry, you don't have to answer it. But you mind if I ask you about tea?
Yeah, sure.
Okay. So I drive my friends nuts.
Chemistry for sure.
I drink tea. I went to coffee once I started working in this TV thing because that's what people do. And the other reason is tea is tough, right? I drive my friends nuts because you have to use boiling water. They have to define tea because I like tea. I don't want any of these herbal things, right? So you have to use boiling water. You can't pour the water first and then put the tea in, as far as I'm concerned. You can't microwave the water to get it boiling hot. That's not going to work. And once you've boiled the water and used it for one cup of tea, if you want another cup of tea, I think it's important to me that you get rid of that water or use it for something else and you start with a fresh pot and boil a fresh pot because there's something about boiling the water, I think, that the tea is going to taste different. Now, am I driving my friends crazy or am I right on?
Well, you're certainly right on, is that there's chemistry involved here. There's no question. I mean, books have been written about tea. There are numerous books, Tea is chemically very complex. A cup of tea, believe it or not, will contain thousands of different compounds originating from the tea plant itself. Plants are just nothing more than chemical banks, containing hundreds and hundreds of different compounds. And some of them are sweet, some of them are bitter, some of them have antioxidant properties like, the polyphenols. Some of them have astringency tendencies. They make your mouth pucker. When you're drinking tea, The question is, which of these compounds are you going to be extracting from the ground up plant material? Well, first of all, how you grind it up already matters, because the finer the ground, the greater the surface area, the faster will be the extraction. On the other hand, grinding it also destroys some of the compounds in the tea. And then you have to get the temperature just right, because you want to be leaching out the flavorful compounds, but you don't want to leach out any of the bitter compounds. Also, when you're boiling the water, the heat will drive some of the oxygen out of the water. Now, we're not talking about the O and H2O here. That, of course, that oxygen is bound chemically to hydrogen. But oxygen, as O2, dissolves in water. Just like salt can dissolve in water, oxygen can dissolve in water. And oxygen gives flavor to water. So if you boil the water too much, you're deoxygenating it, the water is going to taste more bland. And that's why your argument that you should use fresh water for the second cup is totally sound, because you will have more oxygen in it. The temperature of the water is important. If you use a very high temperature, you're going to be dissolving some of the larger compounds, the less soluble ones, which also tend to be the bitter ones. So boiling you don't want boiling water. You want something at a lower temperature. You want something like 70 to 80 degrees. And then, of course, you also have to play around with how long you want to steep that tea. And that depends on your like and your dislike in terms of the intensity of the flavor. But 3 to 5 minutes is usually what is involved. And then there's a whole other controversy: should you put tea into your milk or not? And then whether or not green tea is better than other tea in terms of health. Yeah, I think one can argue that it is. So you're quite right that there are numerous chemical concepts that are involved in consuming tea.
All right, so just a little bit less than boiling water, but I think the reason I really want boiling water is because that little bit less, it doesn't take long until it's not right. So it's easier to take the boiling water and move it to the teacup and just take that chance on it, because you cannot, like, if you get tea in a restaurant and they bring you that silver thing with a tea bag next to it, that is not going to work. So,
well, if you're to talk about tea aficionados, tea bag doesn't even enter.
I know,
into the
I know,
right?
but we all have to make sacrifices, right? So that's
Right.
the one I make.
These days, there's another chemical controversy that comes up with tea bags, and that is the material of which they are made. And they are made either of nylon or polyester. And whenever you're brewing your tea, you're actually also unleashing some nanoplastics. Some of the plastic will go into solution. It comes apart and goes into solution. It's invisible. And I'm sure you've heard of all of the stories about nanoplastics in our body and in our water and in our food. Well, they're there in your tea too if you make them from tea bags.
I'll tell you, I taught piano lessons for 20, 25 years, and the best tea I ever had was, like, every Tuesday night I had an Iranian student, and his father made the best tea, his own blend of leaves that he would put together. I can't compare to that, and I miss that guy. Anyway, so Ardashir, if you're out there, Ardashir, thank you so much.
There's many, many different kinds of tea, so it also comes down to personal preference. I mean, just like coffee. People like different kinds of coffee. People like different kinds of tea. But as you said, there's a lot of chemistry in there.
All right, I'm going to stick to the boiling water. And then I remember I spoke to someone from Australia about this, and he said that they're so strict about it, they won't even bring the pot to the teacup. You have to take the teacup to the pot and hold the pot over the flame while you pour it. That's how they do it. I think they call it a billy or something. Anyway, all right, so we're way off base here. But Dr. Joe, I had a lot more to talk about with you. We did get to the book. I love the story outline that you talk about. And thank you so much for being here. Dozens of books, thousands of online articles available. You talked about science communicating and writing. So I hope that information is also useful to people.
For those people who are interested, we do have a weekly newsletter.
Yes.
And so if you go to our website, which is, as I said, mcgill.ca/OSS, you can sign up for it there. It's informative, and I think it's entertaining. And also on the website, you have access to all my podcasts, videos. I try to produce a couple of short videos every week, make them informative and entertaining, and all of the articles that we have there. So the only thing really you need to remember is mcgill.ca/OSS.
All right. Thank you so much. The book is Superfoods, Silkworms, and Spandex, Science and Pseudoscience in Everyday Life. It is available for pre-order or order right now, depending on when right now is. Like you said, we're on the internet, so right now could be 100 years from right now. It will still be available. And it is McGill Office for Science and Society, mcgill.ca/OSS. Do sign up for the newsletter. There are always links to your videos in there. Those are entertaining, especially you throw a little magic in every once in a while. So I appreciate that as a member of the public and your communication of science. So thank you so much.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks very much.
You're welcome.